guys, today I'm going to discuss about the Spring Cloud configuration through GitHub. So configuration we put in the application.properties file. If the application is in the distributed environment, so it is very difficult from one application to another application to configure the properties file. So if we use the GitHub to maintain the properties file, so it will be very easy. So using Spring Cloud configuration, we can do that very easily. Let me see the picture. Here in the microservice, we have to use the actuator of the Spring in the microservice. So using Spring Cloud configuration server, here to support that, you have to Spring Cloud is provided that configuration, that annotation have to include there. And in the Git, since it's a global and distributed, we can access from anywhere. Now the agenda is Spring Cloud configuration, and any configuration related change will reflect without restart or redeploy our application. And also Spring have the dev tool facility. You don't have to restart anything. So server and client side configuration in distributed system we will cover here. We get central place to manage our external properties file, declare all properties in the global manner. That's in the github.com, which is accessible from everywhere. And first thing is that why Spring Cloud configuration required? What's the drawback of the traditional approach? Say one place we are exposing service, say insurance provider exposing the web service, and from different client 1, client 2 and client 3, they are accessing that. Now the problem is, suppose that URL for that insurance provider web service has been changed. Instead of get all plans, it has been changed to get update plan. Now the problem is that everywhere, say hundreds of clients, in hundreds of clients you have to change that. So it's not feasible in microservice world. So we have multiple microservice. So instead of changing here, if we put uh, GitHub and using the Spring Cloud configuration, will maintain that. So if we are going to call that from client, every client will call the configuration, Spring Cloud configuration, and it will get that data from the GitHub, and GitHub will communicate with that insurance provider. So this way we can handle that problem very easily. Now the solution is that all the client are not directly interact with the provider. Client are interacting with configuration server application through GitHub and then the service. If the change, there's a service change its URL, then only need to update the GitHub, not all the client. So that configuration server application which I am going to create will be acts like a gateway. For demo purpose, what I am going to do, I will create the following: one insurance provider application, that's for the service, one insurance config server application, and one client application, and GitHub repository, that's my GitHub repository where I have to create that. So before creating the service related stuff, uh, let me see the solution here. So here earlier we client are interacting with the insurance provider directly. So instead of communicate with directly, so each client will communicate with the insurance configure server application, and they are using GitHub, that URL, and finally it's communicate with using that, it's communicate with the insurance provider. So here this is Spring Boot applications 1, 2, 3, and this is also Spring Boot application. This is not application, this is a just repository, and this is also Spring Boot application. So how many application there? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For 3 client we have 5 application. And let me check for the insurance provider. So one by one I'm going to create application. This is the web service going to expose for the insurance provider. Here what we just need to expose the service, right? So Spring Boot Web and Spring Boot DevTool, and this way we can expose the service. Here I have exposed the service, just simple REST controller request mapping, and here it's the just all plans, and in the list string, and I have used the Java 8 stream of platinum gold. If we invoke here, then we'll get that string in the JSON format. So we get it platinum, gold, silver. So this one is that insurance provider when we are hitting directly, but hundreds of client going to use that, using hundreds of client application, not we are going to hit it individually. So how can I do that? So to do that, we have to use through insurance configure server applications, which is using GitHub. Okay, and now I'm going to create the repository which will maintain the properties file. Okay, this properties file have the URL of the REST service which has been exposed, and the client, this is the key value pair, right? Client which is using, I have to mention here. So in the GitHub itself, I have to create the repository. So it's the quick step in creating repository. I have just written insurance config server DB, and here I have mentioned insurance provider URL. This is the used for the client, and this URL is used in the service which has been exposed. Okay, and now after committing, now next task is insurance provider config server. So to make it the server, to how can I know that this is the server? You have to include the actuator and config server, and the annotation @enable config server. This will allow to invoke actuator default and access the application.properties file from the GitHub. How we can maintain it? Then this application I am going to create it. This service we have already created, and these applications now I am going to create it. And let me check. So the structure of the application. So this config server, you need actuator, you need config server, and so that you can use that enable config server, and DevTool and web is required. And here we mention the GitHub URL, and its server port we have mentioned as the 888, and in the here I have mentioned @enable config server. So that means actuator default you are able to access it, and here you see that insurance.provider.url pointing to the GitHub source. So here you see that GitHub URL and insurance provider.url which is from the GitHub. So application which has been written in the GitHub, so we can get it from the when we put that GitHub URL. So how much we are going to put that GitHub URL? Up to that project, not to the application.properties file. So we can see that this is the key and this is the value. This value is present in the service side that which has been exposed, and this will be present in the client side. And this is, there is no such Java class, just write @enable config server. Okay, and read that properties. And now the client, let me create one of the client. So this is the workflow client. I put that port as a 9090, and it's communicate with config server, that is 8888, and it will use the GitHub properties, and GitHub will communicate with the service 8080. And here how can I know that this is the client? So in the server we have used config server, where I have used config the annotation enable config server, right, in the main. And here I have used refresh scope. So refresh scope is part of the Spring Cloud context config, and URL change in client and GitHub will reflect. Okay, that's URL change is not client, and it's URL change in service. So we change the URL in service, and client you don't need to do anything. So we interact the client. So change will be done from the client service side, and the GitHub side also need to configure accordingly. So one place we need to change, and one stop solution. And so at the rate value, here is this is the code in the controller in the refresh scope. So how can I invoke the service which has been exposed? So we need that URL first. So how can I get that URL? Insurance provider.url. This is coming from the GitHub. Okay, and so this is the URL itself, and we are just, it is the get mapping, we are going to invoke that. Okay, here instead of request mapping we can make it just directly write fallback method get mapping, and here itself template.get for object we get that data, and this value we can get it. Okay, and here we mention that 9090. So 9090 my plan, it will through GitHub it will invoke the service and we'll get the result. And if we directly hit that service, we know that it's 8080 because we did not mention any port number. So by default 8080 it's a direct hit. So direct hit is not the solution. Our case that we are using through different microservice to communicate. So this is the way we are communicating in the client. So to mention the refresh scope, and now the problem what I have already mentioned, that if we change the URL in the service, now it should be reflect in the client also. Client we are not going to change anything, will not if we change say all plans to change all plans 1. So now you can see that we are not able to hit that because this client is use that config server, and config server pointing to GitHub, and this GitHub has that wrong URL. So you need to correct the GitHub properties also. So if I change service side as well as GitHub properties, so it will reflect the client. So this way we can handle that and manage that distributed application. Okay, thank you very much.